going to have a look now at phobias and the behavioural explanation for what a phobia is. So first we're going to look at the theory. This whole video is going to be looking at the theory, and there's a separate video looking at the evaluation. Okay, so this video will be focusing solely on the theory. How can the behavioural explanation explain phobias? So we've got to have a first look at what the behavioural approach is. And the behavioural approach is all about learning. It states that we learn to have a phobia or learn to have any mental disorder. So the words that are generally used are conditioning, which means learn, and unconditioning or unconditioned, which means it's an unlearned behaviour. And I've already sent you the PowerPoint for this, so I want you to quickly pause this presentation and watch the video that's on the link here for Pavlov's dogs. This is really the start of the behavioural approach. So watch this video, make a few little notes, and you'll never really have to talk about Pavlov's dogs, but it gives you an understanding of how the behavioural approach can be used to explain other behaviours. So hopefully you've watched the video now and have a bit of an understanding about the Pavlov's dogs experiment. And we're just going to have a quick run through it now to make sure you really understand it. So Pavlov put down the food for the dog, and the food is this unconditioned stimulus. It's something we haven't learned to respond to. It's just food put down in front. And the dog brings about an unconditioned response. It starts to salivate. It hasn't learned how to do this. It's unconditioned. It's a natural, innate response. You put the food down, it salivates. So before Pavlov started to do his experiment, he also put this tuning fork down, which was a bit like a bell. You hit it, it makes a noise. And this is the neutral stimulus, so it's been introduced into the scenario. And the dog shows no conditioned response. It doesn't salivate because it doesn't know how to respond to this. It's got no response whatsoever to the tuning fork. So Pavlov thought, right, I'm going to bring the food to the dog. I'm going to bring the food. Every time I bring it, I'm also going to hit this tuning fork. So it's going to make the ringing noise. So every time the dog gets the food, it's also exposed to this ringing noise of the fork. And this is all about association. The dog starts to associate the food with the fork. So every time the dog gets the food as normal, it starts to salivate. It's got this unconditioned response, this natural response to the food. But in the background, there's this little bell going off. And over time, and as Pavlov kept doing this and doing it and repeating, the dog starts to make an association. It associates the food with the noise of the bell and the noise of the fork. So eventually, when Pavlov brings the fork to the dog starts to have a conditioned response. It's learnt to respond to the sound of the bell. The bell now becomes the conditioned stimulus because we've taught the dog to respond to it. So the dog has learned to respond to a stimulus, and it has a set response to that stimulus as well. It has a conditioned response. The dog now associates the bell with the food, and that's why it salivates. In the specification, it states that you need to know about the two-process model. And the two-process model is basically classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is all about association. Just like Pavlov's dogs, we associate one thing with another. And apparently this is how we acquire phobias. This is how we actually develop it. Whereas operant conditioning is all about reinforcement. It's about rewards, it's about punishments. And according to the behavioural explanation, this is how we maintain our phobias over time. So if you have a quick look at the side here, there's a number of phobias listed. You'll know some of them, you won't know others. We've got arachnophobia, the fear of spiders, agoraphobia, so people who are afraid of going into open spaces, cancer phobia, the fear of developing cancer. We've got claustrophobia, the fear of tight spaces. There's an awful lot of phobias, and I suggest you go away and look up maybe 2 or 3 that you could always bring up in an exam. Well, the next video I want you to watch is a very, very famous experiment linked to phobias and classical conditioning. And it's done in 1920, and it's the study of Little Albert by Watson. So pause this video now upload the link for the Little Albert experiment, and then we'll go through it in a minute. Hopefully you've watched the Little Albert video now, and we're now going to go through the different stages of how he developed his phobia, how he learned to develop a phobia of rats, so you can start to link it to all different scenarios in an exam. So if we look first of all, the rat is the neutral stimulus, and it's a neutral stimulus because we have no response to it. There is no natural response to seeing a rat. Little Albert's quite happy to sit there, the rat be in front of it. There's no response whatsoever. However, when Watson hits the bell or hits the iron bar with a hammer, we do get a response. It's a natural, innate response. So the loud noise is that unconditioned stimulus. It's an unlearnt thing. And we have an unlearned response, an unconditioned response to that. The baby starts to cry. So what Watson does, over a long period of time, he starts to introduce the rat to baby Albert. But every time he introduces the rat, he has the loud noise next to it. So every time the baby sees the rat and the loud noise now, he starts to cry. And over time, he starts to associate those two things. And when he sees the rat, which is now a conditioned stimulus, because he's learned to have a response to it, he starts to cry. He's associated the rat with the loud noise of the iron bar, and he's developed a phobia of rats. And the interesting thing about this experiment was that it also generalized to other white furry things. So if Watson stuck on a big Santa beard that was white and furry, it also had the same response. Little Albert would cry his eyes out. He'd develop a phobia of white furry things. Classical conditioning then can really explain how we acquire a phobia, like Little Albert. And operant conditioning is the thing that explains how we maintain a phobia over time. And classical conditioning is all about association, like we've already learned. And operant conditioning now is all about reinforcement. It's about positive reinforcement, so rewarding someone. And if you reward someone, they will generally repeat that behavior. And there's also negative reinforcement, which prevents someone doing something again. And for phobias, we're going to focus on this second one, the negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement can explain the maintenance of a phobia. By avoiding the phobic stimulus, so if we were afraid of spiders, we'd avoid seeing them. So we escape that fear and anxiety that we would get if the spider was close to us. And the absence of that fear, by not being around a spider, by avoiding them, the absence of the fear reinforces our avoidance behavior. We do it more and more. So we avoid it. Everything we've got, we avoid that phobic stimulus, that spider. And if we do that, then we're going to do more and more avoidance behavior. And our phobia is maintained because we're not getting the fear response. So we maintain our phobia by avoiding the phobic stimulus in the first place. If we recap then the key terms that you need to know for AO1, we've got the two-process model. If you ever see that word, remember all it means is classical and operant conditioning. And classical conditioning is how we actually develop or acquire a phobia. We start to associate it. So it might be you develop a phobia of bees because you get stung. You associate every bee with that fear and pain of being stung. You're associating things together. And operant conditioning is all about negative reinforcement. We avoid them. We avoid the phobic stimulus. And because of that, we don't get the fear response. And because of that, our phobia is maintained over time.